Chapter 1251 Change. It's not Dark Angel Sasra. The projection of Anuni has been eroded by the power that surged out from the giant king's residence, becoming a monster that I can't understand at the moment. Furthermore, it looks like it can exist for a long period of time. Perhaps there's a bit of Sasra's will involved in this. With his left hand covering his face, Klein allowed the worms of spirit to burrow through the gaps in his fingers freely. What he couldn't understand the most was something else. He had clearly opened the palace where the dark angel lay slumber, but the deities and kings of angels showed no reaction. According to Klein's imagination, when the surging sea gushed out, be it the true creator, the god of knowledge and wisdom, blasphemer Amon, or Amon's brother who ultimately hid behind the scenes, they should have immediately descended or appeared to confirm Dark Angel Sasra's present state or snatch whatever corresponding items. To his surprise, the entire giant king's court remained completely silent. No external powers exerted any influence. Could it be that they are still waiting for me to enter the giant king's residence and to come into contact with that deputy of heaven? The true creator said to meet Sasra. My spirit body and physical body haven't recovered from the corrosion, which means that the true creator's goal has yet to be achieved. As Klein's thoughts raced, he realized that he was unable to control his emotions, be it anger, sadness, worry, or depression. He couldn't help but pull the corners of his mouth up and let out a scoff. The only thing he was glad about was that this didn't affect his brain. He could still think and use all sorts of beyonder powers, but sometimes, his madness would suddenly be aggravated, turning him rash and aggressive. I wonder if the demigod of the mind has any way to treat this situation. In any case, the sealed artifacts or beyonder characteristics that I can summon can't do it. This is a result of an incomplete spirit. If I don't resolve my severed shadow, I probably won't be able to completely recover. However, perhaps there are methods that can allow me to temporarily return to normal. For example, create a virtual persona to make up for the incompleteness. Unfortunately, I can't enter Sapphira Castle. Klein's thoughts were in a mess as the scenes that surfaced in his mind gradually vanished. He then picked up the half-top hat that had dropped to the ground and wore it. Then, through the huge glass window formed from ground orange gems, he observed the changes in the giant king's court. Unlike before, an illusory sun appeared high in the sky, allowing the magnificent building complex situated in the frozen sunset to enjoy the sun at noon. The troll statues that stood guard in the various palaces seemed to be draped with a cloak weaved out of shadows. Anuni, who had a pair of black, illusory wings on his back, and the shadow that originally belonged to Klein jumped over the railing and glided towards him. Klein's gaze froze as he subconsciously took a few steps forward, intending to fight the enemy. But very quickly, he snapped back to his senses and checked his current state. He quickly retreated to the ancient elevator, pulled the switch, and landed back in the barren tunnel. Then, with blink, he appeared near the waning forest and ran all the way to the edge of the giant king's court. His intuition told him that in his current state, he had no means of defeating the mutated Anuni and his separated shadow. Of course, he had the confidence if it was just the latter. When he arrived at the edge of the radiant sunlight, he turned and saw that Anuni and his shadow hadn't chased after him. It was as though there was a limit to their range of activity. There's no way to leave the giant king's residence, or should I say, be too far away from Dark Angel Sasra. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Klein saw the illusionary sun atop leap from the center to the west. The dusk's colors once again enveloped the divine kingdom. Klein carefully observed all of this and was in no hurry to leave the giant king's court. Not long after, the illusory sun plunged into the palace where Dark Angel Sasra slumbered. Darkness became the ruler of the giant king's court. The darkness was different from the one found on a normal night. There was no moon or starlight, only blurry shadows. Standing in this darkness, Klein had a nagging feeling that someone was clinging to him from behind. However, he clearly knew that it was an illusion and didn't turn around recklessly. A few minutes later, the illusory sun rose, and the light of dawn dispersed the darkness. The power that surged out from the dark angel's chamber has changed the giant king's court despite it being an ancient divine kingdom. It really is a power that's close to that of a true deity. At the very least, it controls a uniqueness, but which pathway's uniqueness would it be? The generated changes include blazing sun, darkness, degeneration, and mutation. This is a little contradictory. It doesn't seem like the result of a single uniqueness. Besides, the uniqueness of the sun pathway is definitely with the eternal blazing sun. The shadow and degeneration is brought about by darkness, which is undoubtedly with the true creator. When I opened the door, I saw an illusory, pitch-black, viscous ocean. It's related to the Chaos Sea. Klein shook his head as he continued observing. This continued on as he waited for the City of Silver's expedition team to rendezvous with him. Backlund, at the border of the city. As soon as Audrey entered, she discovered that the fog had become unusually thick. Visibility had been reduced to 5 meters. The howling winds swept through the fog, bringing a sense of clarity from time to time. However, it was soon filled with surging whiteness. Audrey's eyes suddenly turned golden, allowing her to see even further. As she carefully treaded, the fog in front of her suddenly became much thinner. At the same time, her beyonder powers suffered a retrogression. The weakening of mysticism. The concepts and information previously mentioned by Mr. World flashed across her mind. Boom! 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 Multiple salvos from Backlund fired ahead, causing the shells to leave trails of red, blue, silver, or black in their wake as they bombarded the enemy's base. However, in the next second, these shells encountered invisible barriers and exploded in midair, making the transparent wall tremble. At this moment, a rather blurry figure appeared in the distant, thick fog. He was in human form, but he was more than 10 meters tall. His torso and waist each had 2 arms extending out as he emitted a rich darkness. For some reason, as the figure that seemed to arise from a legend appeared, the Fasak and Intis allied forces base stirred. Every soldier and officer there seemed to have returned to their childhood. They were walking alone on the dark road with no one around them. Everything was silent. They felt uneasy deep down. The fear of the unknown stemmed from the fear of their imaginations. Instantly, they broke down and turned to flee. At this moment, radiant sunlight shone on them, allowing them to see light and bringing them courage. However, there were still a small number of soldiers who were unable to control themselves. They kept shouting "Mommy" or a particular woman's name in their bids to escape from the battlefield. Bang! 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 The soldiers fell to the ground amidst repeated gunshots. One by one, they bloomed with blood-colored flowers. They landed on the ground, turning motionless after slightly twitching. No one cared what their names were, nor did anyone know of their past. Right on the heels of that, under the commanding officer's orders, the invisible barrier that enveloped the Intis and Fasak allied forces was dispelled. Crimson-red flaming spears were thrown out towards the lone base as though they could blot out the sky. Just as the flaming spears approached their target, they scattered in a sudden bout of chaos. They stabbed into the ground, creating one pitch-black hole after another. It was the first time Audrey was seeing such a large-scale usage of beyonder powers. Momentarily stunned, she couldn't help but recall the people she knew and the roles they played in this battle. Glaint and the other young nobles had joined the army and took on the roles of officers at different ranks. They were scattered all over the battlefield and could be killed at any moment. The magician had left Backlund with Judgment's family and was hiding in a small city in East Chester County. As a middle-ranking member of MI9, Judgment was made to covertly defend against infiltration by the Beyonders from Fasak, Intis, and other countries. The official Beyonders led by the Star had locked down the various cathedrals of the Church of Steam, maintaining the stability of the city. Saint Anthony and the other demigods of the Church of Evernight, the Church of Storms, the Royal Family, and the military began to set up the last line of defense in Backlund. The Sanguine had remained neutral the entire time. A few seconds later, Audrey gathered her thoughts and prepared to use psychological invisibility to sneak into the enemy's camp to spread mental plague. Suddenly, her spiritual perception stirred as she cast her gaze to a spot further away. In the thick fog, a rather thick and blurry tentacle wrapped around countless silver bolts of lightning and quickly extended to a certain location of the Allied forces' base. A feather burning with golden flames fell. In the depths of the thick fog, a huge grayish-blue palm reached out, holding a silver broadsword. The fog sea, away from the safe sea route. Countless bolts of lightning struck the surface of the sea, waves surged and crashed heavily. Bernadette's dawn was constantly being thrown into the sky, making it seem extremely minute under the might of the elements. It looked like it would sink at any moment. Queen Mystic stood at the bow of the ship, calmly taking in all of this. From time to time, she would use the Emperor's new clothes and other fairy tale magic to maintain the balance of the boat. Her gaze pierced through the terrifying storm in search of the suspected primitive island. After some reorganizing, Colin Iliad led Derek, Lovia, and the other members of the expedition team out of Afternoon Town Camp. They followed the path up the mountain and entered the giant king's court. What surprised them was that the frozen dusk had changed. Bright sunlight illuminated every corner. "Where's the helper you invited?" Colin Iliad controlled his alarm and turned to ask Derek Berg. Just as Derek was about to speak, he suddenly saw a figure walk out from a half-collapsed tower. The figure wore a black trench coat and a silk top hat. The right side of his face was cut, cold and stiff. The left side of his face had transparent, wriggling maggots that kept crawling. Chapter 1252 Mr. Clown. When they saw the figure walking out from behind the collapsed tower, the members of the City of Silver's expedition team immediately put up a defensive stance, ready to attack or provide any defense. In their eyes, the man wearing strange clothes and a strange hat was equivalent to a monster, a particularly terrifying one at that. Even normal Beyonders would view themselves as monsters after being subject to such a physical mutation. Upon seeing the reactions of the half-giants, Klein grinned widely and said with a beaming smile, "Hello everyone, I'm Gehrman Sparrow. All of you should be glad that I can still control myself. Otherwise, you would have lost your minds because you looked at me directly." As he spoke, the transparent maggots on the left side of his face and neck were still squirming slowly. Beneath the clothes on the left side of his body, there were protruding marks that gently squirmed. A monster. The members of the City of Silver who were not demigods were increasingly certain of their own judgment. You are the war, no, Mr. Sparrow." Derek Berg finally managed to recognize Mr. World, who he had met once. Klein raised his left palm and covered his left cheek. He smiled and said, "Life is always about encountering the unexpected." Without waiting for Little Sun to respond, he paused and said, "I have already opened the door to the Giant King's residence." This brought about some accidents, causing the Divine Kingdom to change. The door to the Giant King's residence has already been opened. The grizzled and scarred Colin Iliad narrowed his eyes. He subconsciously looked up at the magnificent buildings shrouded in golden sunlight. However, due to the distance, he couldn't see the situation at the apex. However, to have the frozen sunset become replaced by the blazing sun at noon had explained many things. Klein's gaze swept across the City of Silver's chief and elder Lovia, who was dressed in black armor, of the 6-member council. He then looked at the sun and continued with a smile, "This has also brought me some negative effects, just as you have already noticed." At this point, he clapped his hands and said in a commanding tone, like an adult instructing children, "All right, Beyonders below the level of demigod are to fall back. The Giant King's court after the anomaly is not a place you can enter." The members of the expedition team, apart from Colin, Derek, and Lovia, felt an inexplicable sense of fear as they cast their gazes at the chief. Colin Iliad remained silent for a few seconds before turning to them and saying, "Leave the Giant King's court and wait at the periphery. If you see the signal, immediately act according to plan. The hand-picked expedition team members were not only strong themselves and close in strength to a demigod, but they also had different powerful sealed artifacts that complemented each other. Even if they were facing a saint, they weren't without hope when it came to defeating one. However, in the City of Silver's original plan, they weren't the main force. Therefore, Colin Iliad had led them here in the hope that, when he and the other demigods shaved off the hidden enemies, these team members would be able to shine. They could then use the different sealed artifacts to deal with different incidents, preventing the entire team from suffering from any weaknesses. Now, with powerful help from the outside joining them, and the fact that the giant king's court had indeed experienced some sort of anomaly, no one knew what they would encounter if they went deeper. With the utmost caution, Colin Iliad believed that Gehrman Sparrow's suggestion wasn't a problem. Furthermore, he had his own selfish thoughts. He didn't want members other than the demigods to suffer any unnecessary risks or meaningless casualties. Therefore, he agreed to the opinion of the monster-like powerhouse. When the time came for an opportunity to show itself, he, Lovia, and Derek would be able to give a signal and let the team members rush over a cleared path to provide reinforcements. As for the entire team's beyonder powers not being able to deal with different situations due to it collectively becoming relatively monotonous, Colin Iliad wasn't too worried since the former shepherd, Lovia, was around. The members of the expedition, who weren't demigods, exchanged looks and hesitated for a moment. In the end, they still chose to listen to Colin Iliad. "Yes, Your Excellency." At the same time that they answered, they gave Derek Berg a deep look, as though they were trying to remind their chief to be careful of this sequence 4 demigod. He actually knew a living, monster-like powerhouse. This was very suspicious to the residents of the City of Silver, who had barely seen any outsiders. Sensing his companion's obvious distrust, Derek's heart ached as his eyes nearly welled up in tears. But eventually, he didn't make any excuses. He maintained his silence and straightened his back. After the other members of the expedition team retreated from the giant king's court, Klein smiled and pointed at the 2 demigods. "Let me guess. You must be the chief of the City of Silver, the former demon hunter, the present Silver Knight, Colin Iliad. You are the Hanged Man's believer, Black Knight Lovia, who had helped him shepherd." Lovia's grey eyes, which were hidden behind her visor, narrowed. "You really look like a clown. The Hanged Man?" Upon hearing Mr. World's words, Derek almost doubted his ears. He even imagined that Elder Lovia had something to do with Mr. Hanged Man, but he quickly remembered the exact image of the fallen creator, a naked man hanging upside down on a cross. Mr. World used the Hanged Man to refer to the fallen creator. Elder Lovia chided him for being impolite. Derek, who had just exceeded 2 meters in height, nodded thoughtfully as he praised Mr. World's guts from the bottom of his heart. He actually dared to give a true deity a nickname, and even said it out loud in front of his follower. Colin Iliad looked at Gehrman Sparrow and then at Lovia. Unable to tell who was right or wrong, he calmly said, "Let's continue moving forward." He had already pulled out the 2 swords on his back and allowed them to be blanketed with the dawn's glow. "No problem." With a smile, Klein turned around and walked to the left of a huge stone staircase with the 3 demigods of the City of Silver. After walking for a while, they saw the familiar rugged pathway. On one side of the road was a towering cliff, and on the other side was an afternoon sun-soaked, bottomless cloud. At this moment, Klein and company felt the vibrations of the ground. They saw large amounts of illusory, pitch-black gases surging out from deep within the golden cloud. With a whoosh, the rugged pathway collapsed, falling into the dark, water surface. Beneath the water surface, there seemed to be invisible maelstrom lurking. "Huh, it collapsed. There's no way out. Haha." Klein bent down laughing loudly, making Colin's, Derek's, and Lovia's nerves tense up. It took Klein a few seconds to regain control of his emotions. He straightened his body and took out a piece of white paper from his pocket with a smile plastered across his face. He folded it into a plain. "Phew. He blew at the head of the paper plane, swung his arm, and threw it towards the clouds that had been devoured by darkness. At the same time, the glove on his left hand was covered with slippery fish scales. Upon seeing this scene, the originally confused Colin Iliad nodded slightly before casting his gaze at the flying paper object. A violent wind stirred as it carried the paper plane forward in flight for a few seconds. Then, it suddenly dissipated, and like a stone, it rapidly plummeted into the dark clouds, without causing any ripples. From the looks of it, flying is useless. Klein turned halfway around and smiled at Derek and company. Lovia didn't respond as she released a translucent soul that enveloped a piece of gravel. In the blink of an eye, that piece of rock disappeared from its original spot, blinking to a spot above the dark clouds. Following that, it fell down uncontrollably and sank into the clouds. Teleport doesn't work either, Lovia said in a slightly deep voice. As Klein pressed at his abdomen, he bent down and chuckled before saying, "It looks like we can only enter through the main entrance." Derek immediately turned around and was about to head back when Colin Iliad and Lovia looked at each other and nodded indiscernibly. The four demigods quickly returned to the huge, grayish-white stone staircase and looked up. Above the flight of silent stairs which had very high steps, the majestic city walls were covered with burn marks. There were even arrows shafts as thick as ordinary trees. In the middle of the city wall was a door that was tens of meters tall. It was grayish-blue in color and there were golden nails embedded on its surface. On both sides of the door stood a guard that stood at 6 meters tall in a domineering manner. They wore exquisite silver full-body armor, one holding a great sword, the other a huge axe. Behind their visors was an orange glow. Silver Knight. These were 2 Silver Knight's guards. Without wasting any time, Colin Iliad quickly retracted his gaze and said to Gehrman Sparrow, "I'll hold back one of the Silver Knights. Quickly finish off the other one." He wasn't very sure of Gehrman Sparrow's strength, but from the admiration and respect that he sensed from Derek Berg, as well as the fact that he had opened up the residence of the Giant King, he determined that this demigod who was blessed by the Fool was no weaker than him. Under such circumstances, whether it was Gehrman Sparrow or Colin Iliad, it wasn't difficult for them to quickly kill a Silver Knight guard with the help of Lovia and Derek. After all, they weren't living demigods, but a special statue without any intelligence. Just as Colin Iliad finished his sentence, he saw Gehrman Sparrow bend his back and laugh out loud. "Why do you care so much about these 2 toys? If they were still alive and could think, Real Silver Knights, I would definitely be as cautious as you are. But now, watch." As he spoke, Klein used his left hand, which had many worms of spirit crawling about, to press down on his top hat. He straightened his body and briskly walked up the stairs. Then, he was surrounded by strong winds as he approached the main door of the Giant King's court. During this process, he casually raised his right hand and shook it a few times, as if he was stretching his wrist or grabbing the air. At the end of the last action, Klein's shoulder sank slightly as if it had frozen, but nothing appeared in the void. Colin Iliad originally wanted to have an understanding of Gehrman Sparrow's strength, so he didn't stop him. He only signaled for Lovia to follow, to back him up if he made any mistakes. However, at that moment, he suddenly slowed down. He frowned slightly as if he had caught the scent of something. As for Derek, he looked at him with slight admiration. He believed that Mr. World could quickly finish off the guards. Chapter 1253 I wish you well. Only when Klein was about to reach the end of the flight of stone steps did the 2 Silver Knights guards outside the Giant King's court react. They turned their heads as the orange glow behind their visors flashed twice, as though it was confirming the identity of the visitor. Furthermore, they had a moment of confusion. Half of Klein's face was normal, and the other half was terrifying. The right side of his mouth curled up exaggeratedly. The transparent maggots on his left slowly twisted, revealing a frightening and indifferent smile. Thud. With his right foot crossing the final step, he arrived at the platform where the Giant King's court was located. Suddenly, a silvery white crack appeared on Klein's forehead as countless silver rays emitted from his body. His entire body instantly shattered into pieces of flesh and blood. These fragments floated up and quickly thinned and faded, turning into paper shreds. Klein in his top hat and black trench coat appeared one after another in different spots. However, they were all ripped apart by the silver sword beams. Some of them degenerated into illusions, while others turned into paper figures. At this moment, a figure suddenly appeared outside the main door of the giant king's court where two guards had disappeared. It was a huge doll dressed in a dark and complicated long dress with evil vines wrapped around it. Rionette Tinker. When Klein climbed up the stone steps, the person he summoned was none other than Miss Messenger. However, she had appeared in wraith form, so Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek didn't see her. At this moment, the two silver knights who had concealed their evil intentions and were hiding with the help of the light were chasing Klein out of instinct. They had already exposed their whereabouts after the angel-level powerhouse's prolonged observations. Rionette Tinker's bright red eyes immediately reflected a seemingly blank area. There was a flash of light, and a white rabbit suddenly jumped out of nowhere. It bounced around and circled the area, its eyes abnormally vapid. Immediately following that, Miss Messenger took a step forward and disappeared. In another area, the remaining knight in silver armor appeared. His actions turned stiff and slow. He had been possessed by a wraith. Klein, who had used himself as bait, stopped, blinking. He pressed his hand to his chest and gave a very ceremonial bow. "I found the two of you. I wish you well." He straightened his body, raised his right hand, and snapped his fingers. Boom! The white-furred rabbit suddenly exploded, its flesh splattering all over the ground. Then, he walked towards the silver knight guard who tried his best to struggle but to no avail. When the two figures crossed each other, Rionette Tinker's historical projection returned to the fog of history, while the silver knight followed closely behind Klein and very obediently returned to the edge of the stone steps with him. He had already become Klein's marionette. "We can enter." Klein smiled as he said to Colin Iliad and the others at the bottom of the stone stairs. Derek's eyes lit up as he inwardly marveled. Mr. World is really powerful. He managed to finish off two silver knight guards single-handedly so quickly. Colin Iliad turned his head to glance at Lovia. From her gaze, he could sense her heavy emotions. The City of Silver's chief had no change in expression. He held the two swords that refracted the light of dawn and steadily walked up the stone steps. He came to Klein's side and whispered, "Mutant." Klein pressed down a worm of spirit that formed his left eye and smiled without answering. After Derek and Lovia walked up the stairs, the four demigods and a marionette turned and arrived at the main door of the giant king's court. During this process, Klein stowed away the silver knight beyonder characteristic that had seeped out from the rabbit. This was a reward for Rionette Tinker. According to the agreement between him and the angel, the spoils of war that Klein had obtained from summoning a historical projection would be split equally with Miss Messenger. Rionette Tinker took the beyonder characteristic, while Klein obtained a silver knight marionette. He looked up at the main door and made the silver knight guard, who was much taller than him, take a few steps forward and insert the sword into the ground. Then, the silver knight bent down and stretched out his hands to press on the door that was dozens of meters tall. After a heavy screeching sound, the door with golden nails slowly opened. At this moment, the sun in the sky leaped, and the entire giant king's court froze into an orange-red dusk. The huge door opened faster and faster, and the scene inside was gradually revealed to Klein and company. A grayish-white figure was covered in orange-red light. Countless stairs extended from behind the door all the way to the tallest and most magnificent residence of the giant king. On the way, there were no obstacles. There were palaces and towers on both sides. Giant statues covered in iron-colored armor stood in front of different buildings, guarding the path that led to the residences of the god. "It's time for you to perform." Klein turned his head to the side and gave an exaggerated smile to Colin Iliad and Lovia. The former demon hunter, Colin, nodded slightly without any objections. Behind Lovia, an illusory figure covered in silver armor with dark red eyes that was several meters tall appeared. Pa! 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 The giant statues on both sides of the Divine Kingdom's staircase emitted silvery white beams as they emitted shattering sounds. The silver flowers that bloomed kept spreading upwards as if they were welcoming the guests. Before long, 3 silver knights, Colin Iliad, the soul, grazed by Lovia, and the marionette controlled by Klein, cleared out the giant statues guarding the Divine Kingdom's staircase, leaving only the area closest to the giant king's residence. They didn't attempt it out of caution. At that moment, 2 figures flew out of the giant king's palace and slid towards the 3 silver knights. One of them had a shadowed face, black, curly hair that reached its shoulders, and a pair of black wings on its back. The other was a pure shadow that distorted to the sides from time to time. They were Anuni, who had mutated at some point in time, and Klein's shadow, who were both under the influence of the Dark Angel. In the battlefield filled with thick fog, a layer of grayish-white dragon scales suddenly appeared on Audrey's body. This was a result of her seeing something she shouldn't see. Even with the fog blocking her view, high-level creatures at the angel level could still corrupt and damage living beings that saw them. As a demigod of the spectator pathway, Audrey immediately retracted her gaze and calmed her mind to control herself from losing control. As her thoughts raced, she took a few steps back and used psychological invisibility to hide in the thick fog. She was in no hurry to infiltrate the Intis and Fasak allied forces camp. She was waiting for an opportunity, one that she believed would definitely appear. Time passed by so slowly that Audrey imagined that it had stopped. After an unknown period of time, she finally saw the fog over the allied forces' base turn dark, like the sun plunging past the horizon. Night had begun to rule this world. Silently, the Intis, Fasak soldiers and officers closed their eyes and fell asleep. This included many other Beyonders. Audrey, who was hiding not far away, also fell asleep. However, as a dreamwalker who had been cued in advance, she managed to stay lucid. Then, without knowing how long the opportunity would last, she used dream traversal to enter the Intis, Fasak allied forces base. She walked among the soldiers and secretly left behind the seeds for a mental plague. This plague could make the infected panic, fluster, and break down emotionally. It was difficult to be placated with normal methods. Hum. The sound of a horn pierced through the gaps between reality and dreams, shattering the hazy world and awakening the soldiers and officers. Audrey didn't hesitate. At the instant before the dream completely shattered, she traversed to the other end of the camp, far away from the group that had planted the seeds of mental plague. In the next second, the dream world completely collapsed, forcing her back into reality. She appeared at the borders of the Intis, Fasak allied forces base. Thud. A silvery white beam lit up, exploding beside Audrey, tearing apart the fog. Audrey didn't panic because being attacked was within her expectations. After entering the Intis, Fasak allied forces camp, she knew that her psychological invisibility was very likely to be seen through by others using other clues, such as not being able to completely conceal her malice. Therefore, apart from her psychological invisibility, she also used similar techniques and Hand of Horrors disorder to create another fake version of herself to mislead the possible attackers. In other words, there was still a layer of illusion hidden under her psychological invisibility. And the facts proved that Audrey's understanding of the enemy was correct. The fake version of her had indeed encountered a sudden attack. Taking this opportunity, she retreated into the depths of the fog. Then, a grayish-white dragon that was still in human form appeared. It had mysterious and three-dimensional symbols engraved on its huge scales. They were infiltrating inwards and extending outwards, as though they were interweaving into something indescribable. Something that didn't belong to reality would cause one's mind to go into a frenzy and distort their thoughts just by looking at it. At the same time, a figure dressed in a Faceac general's attire appeared at the spot where Audrey was standing. His face, neck, and palm were covered in silver armor, giving off a cold feeling. Enuni and Klein's shadows landed on a platform covered in orange light. The three silver knights retreated and returned to Derek's and Klein's side. Klein raised his hand to cover his left cheek and laughed at the shadow and Enuni. "It looks like you can't leave that area." He took a few steps forward and spread out his palms. He sked and said, "What a pity. That way, you won't be able to hit me." Bang! The shadow opened its mouth and released an air cannon. Chapter 1254 Exaggerated Bang. When the shadow blasted an air cannon forward, Klein acted as though he had sensed it ahead of time. His body jerked backward, and he somersaulted in the air, landing steadily several steps away. During this process, his right hand continued to press down on the half-top hat on his head, making him seem rather relaxed. Seeing that Enuni and the shadow didn't attempt to chase and continue their attacks, the smile on his face became even more obvious. "It's really impolite to interrupt others while they're speaking. I wanted to discuss how to deal with you in front of all of you, but I can only avoid that now." As he spoke, his left face, which formed from a cluster of transparent maggots, trembled twice, as if he was trying to wink at his former marionette and his former shadow. Then, with a beaming smile on his face, he walked back to Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia and shrugged. "The owners of this place aren't welcoming us. We can only head out and discuss how to resolve the problem, them." Colin Iliad didn't think lowly of this exaggerated powerhouse just because he didn't seem capable of controlling his emotions. This was because he had shown his expertise and meticulousness towards detail when handling the previous matters. This wasn't something a demigod who had lost his mind could do. "All right." The City of Silver's chief responded to Klein's suggestion. Of course, Derek had no objections, while Lovia remained silent and didn't say a word. Hence, the four demigods and the Silver Knight marionette retraced their steps. They walked out of the giant king's court's door, and Klein even got the silver-armored guard to pull the huge door and slowly close it. It appeared like a very polite gesture. Throughout the entire process, Enuni, who had layers of black wings on his back, and the pure shadow just stood watching. They didn't attempt to stop him, as though an invisible wall had restrained their movements. After a while, dusk dissipated and darkness descended. All awaited the light of dawn to illuminate everything. In this quiet and dead world, a ray of light finally rose, bringing with it a long-awaited dawn. At this moment, Enuni and the shadow heard knocking sounds at the door of the giant king's court. Someone was knocking on the door. Knock, knock, knock. After this continued a few more times, the door let out a creaking sound as it opened heavily. Wearing a black trench coat, Klein maintained the smile on the right side of his face as he entered the giant king's court first. He walked up the stairs step by step, and the other demigods, along with his marionette, followed one step behind. After reaching the end of the halfway, Klein stopped and said to Enuni and the shadow, who were more than 10 meters away, "Please forgive me for not waiting for you to say, 'Come in.' Perhaps it's because this spot is too far from the main door, so you didn't hear my knocking. As you know, as a gentleman, I only know how to use my fingers to strike, not slap with my palms." The moment he finished speaking, Enuni, who hadn't spoken since the beginning, spoke. "Next, you'll deal with Shadow by yourself and let the people of the City of Silver hold me back." "Oh." Klein let out a loud nasal grunt while wearing an exaggerated smile, as though he was waiting for Enuni to give a further explanation. At the same time, he raised his left hand and pressed his face. The transparent and twisted maggots began to squirm about, some boring in, others crawling out and quickly completing an exchange. With a shadow over his face, Enuni, with his black, slightly curled hair that reached his shoulders, continued in a deep voice, you didn't summon a projection from the historical void in advance because you know that Shadow can summon the projection of the staff of the stars and simulate the powers of the Angel of Time. It will accelerate the flow of time to disperse your angel helpers. Similarly, he didn't make any preparations because of the same reason. And if you summon a saint that can last longer, he can do the same. Both of you offset each other. I hate playing cards with myself. Klein nodded heavily, expressing his agreement and laughed out loud. Enuni, whose face was blurry, glanced at him and the three demigods of the City of Silver. Therefore, you turned the Silver Knight guarding the door into your marionette, planning on using it as a chip to tip the balance. This problem is his, not mine. He actually doesn't have a target to turn into a marionette. Or perhaps, why don't you sacrifice yourself? The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he said to his former marionette, Enuni. Enuni retracted his gaze and turned to examine Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia. You and Shadow cancel each other out. The prerequisite for using a marionette to win is that they can hold me back. Just as he said that, the two shoulders of the marionette that had been corrupted by the power of the sleeping dark angel squirmed as a head grew out of each. The three heads were covered in shadows and had black curly hair that reached his shoulders. However, they gave people the feeling that one was young and the other old. Before Klein and the demigods could react, Enuni's right body suddenly tore apart, causing the aged head to take away a third of his body. The body that split apart rapidly squirmed and instantly became complete. On the shadow over the head's surface, a pair of eyes protruded with vertical, pale golden pupils. Suddenly, the magnificent staircase leading to the ancient god's residence collapsed, turning into a desolate moor. At the end of the moor was a pitch-black city overgrown with weeds. City of Silver. Derek's heart tightened upon seeing such a realistic scene. He was worried that the unknown enemy would drag him and the other demigods to the City of Silver and destroy it. As for Lovia, her gaze froze as her body trembled when Enuni grew two heads. It was as if she could sense the aura of an absolute high-leveled entity. Colin Iliad surveyed his surroundings and crossed his two swords that were covered in the light of dawn before pushing them out. He said in a deep voice, "This is fake." At this moment, Klein covered his mouth with his left hand that was made of transparent maggots. He yawned and asked Enuni's main body with a smile, "Will you be stronger in dreams? Or can you cross the boundary and launch an attack?" "Yes, if it were me, I would definitely consider using a dream to lure the enemy into entering my attack range." The moment he said that, the desolate moor and the distant castle dissipated at the same time. The magnificent staircase, which was illuminated by the light of dawn, appeared once again. At this moment, the left side of Enuni's body tore away. The young head had taken away a third of his flesh. The shadow covering his face was quickly replaced by a resplendent golden light. It was as if there were two miniature suns in his eyes. The sun? Klein first voiced out a question before laughing so hard that he couldn't straighten his back. "Huh, you want to use the unshadowed domain to break through the Silver Knight's light concealment?" "Yes, we have 3 Silver Knights on our side. That is worthy of your attention, but have you considered the feelings of Shadow? You don't, you only think of yourself. He's only a shadow, so have you considered how weakened he would be in the unshadowed domain?" At this point, Klein laughed even louder. Even the transparent worms of spirit crawling on his left face sped up their movements. "Ha ha ha ha, also, have you thought about the beyonder powers of corruption, degeneration, and darkness? Have you seriously considered the negative effects that the unshadowed domain will bring you?" After laughing, Klein straightened his back and asked seriously, "How should I address you now?" "NN. You. NNI." Enuni, whose main body was still covered in shadows, slowly took a deep breath and said, "If you had chosen the hunter pathway, you would definitely be stronger than you are now." Before he could finish his sentence, the layers of black wings on his back suddenly spread out. They kept expanding, covering the sky and wrapped towards the magnificent staircase. Faint shadows immediately covered the area. Then, Enuni directly crossed the invisible boundary and descended in front of Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek. He actually had the means to break through the obstruction. The young him, who had split off as the Sun Saint, immediately raised his arms. The light of dawn turned blazing hot, illuminating every corner of the magnificent staircase, leaving no shadows. Nothing could hide within. Unshadowed domain. However, the shadows around him didn't fade. The dark wings that enveloped Enuni's body blocked out pure sunlight. As for shadow, it seemed to be covered in a cloak. Although it was much dimmer, it didn't show any signs of weakness. At the same time, Enuni's split-off aged body pushed out his right palm. A violent but illusory gust of wind appeared around him, carrying with it an invisible, multicolored intent that gushed towards Klein in his silver knight marionette. Mind deprivation. It could awe the target, make him feel fear, show signs of frenzy, or lose a portion of his rationality. And now, because Klein's spirit was incomplete, he was on the brink of losing control. He couldn't even control his emotions and reactions very well. If he were to suffer the effects of mind deprivation, there was a high chance that he would lose control on the spot and break down into a monster. Enuni understood what had happened to him and understood his weakness. The moment he launched the attack, he allowed the Spectator Saint to use an area-of effect attack that Klein would find difficult to defend against and find unbearable. The strong winds that were tainted with all kinds of emotions and will instantly engulfed Klein. However, half of the crazy adventurer, who had half a normal body and half a terrifying body, didn't show any sign of warped expressions, manifestation of godhood, or physical breakdown. Instead, his exaggerated smiling right eye became extremely calm. While waiting for the City of Silver's expedition team, he had already summoned Miss Justice and got her to make up a virtual persona that stemmed from his lampooning, clown-like character, allowing his spirit to become complete for a certain amount of time. This was the reason why he appeared relatively rational when he left the guard's residence, only to appear exaggerated and crazy when he rendezvoused with the City of Silver's expedition team. Furthermore, this virtual persona could also withstand several attacks from the mind domain. The coldness in his eyes quickly faded away. The corner of his right lip curled up, becoming symmetrical with a curled worm of spirit that was crawling on the left. This was a sincere smile. Chapter 1255. Mocking himself as the smile of sincerity appeared on Klein's face, the face of the Spectator Saint that Enuni had split suddenly cracked open. The silver cracks were all over the place, intertwining with each other, appearing extremely chaotic. Klein seized the opportunity and used his silver knight marionette's silver sword to condense a silver rapier to attack him. A sharp light shot out, dicing that figure into countless small pieces. However, these small blocks were abnormally illusory, with zero corporealness. The Spectator Saint had used the technique of psychological invisibility to create an illusion, concealing his existence. Swoosh! 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 Silver beams of light either blazed towards the Spectator Saint that Enuni had split off, or directly leaped out from the target's location, erupting from within. The Spectator Saint relied on the speed and agility that a powerful body brought. He constantly changed positions and dodged, preventing himself from getting injured. As he had a precise understanding and control of his psyche and mind, Klein's intuition for danger prevented an image from forming in his mind, so it was difficult for Klein to predict his actions. Therefore, Klein couldn't let the silver rapier lay in wait and strike out where he appeared. Tap! 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 The huge knight, who was covered in solid silver armor, held his broadsword and charged at his target, as though he could topple a mountain. Due to the existence of the unshadowed domain, Klein's silver knight marionette was unable to hide himself using the light. He could only directly attack. Upon seeing this, the Spectator Saint's body suddenly swelled, turning into a hideous, grayish-white scaled dragon that was covered in shadows, a manifestation of godhood. The dragon's body was huge, its gray scales firm. Its claws were powerful, and it managed to block the silver knight's slash. Bang! 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 The giant and the giant dragon smashed through the brick rocks of the ancient divine kingdom, causing the palace to collapse. It was a mess. Klein maintained his exaggerated smile and seriously controlled his marionette to ignore Shadow. No, he still did some level of interference. He controlled the spirit-body threads of himself, the marionette, the City of Silver's chief, Lovia, and little son, preventing them from being controlled by Shadow. From time to time, he would reach out his hand and summon the historical projection that Shadow was attempting to summon. This effectively cancelled out both parties' efforts. Apart from that, Klein didn't even glance at Shadow. Shadow wandered for a while before opening its mouth helplessly and making a bang sound. An air cannon shot out and struck the Silver Knight marionette before exploding. Amidst the rumbling sound, the marionette only shook slightly before returning to normal. The silver armor he wore didn't show a single crack. Haha. Upon seeing this scene, Klein laughed out loud, giving off the feeling that he was about to bend over in a fit of laughter. How could he not be aware of how weak his attacks and defense were? When the two core skills of controlling spirit-body threads and the summoning of the historical void projections were rendered ineffective, Shadow, who had no marionettes, could only watch from the side. Be it air cannons, flame controlling, illusion creation, or the clown's combat ability, they were all just embellishments or support. Likewise, Klein didn't attack Shadow, because he knew how frustrating it was to deal with paper figurine substitutes, flaming jump, damage transfer, and illusion creation. He knew that there was no way he could deal with the other party in such a short period of time. He might as well let him be a member of the live audience. After all, he couldn't affect the battle. Upon hearing the mocking laughter, the pitch-black Shadow froze for a moment before pouncing forward. It approached Klein and targeted him with attacks. On the other side, when Anuni's true form landed in front of the three demigods of the City of Silver, Colin Iliad quickly glanced at Derek before looking away. He crossed his swords, forming a cross that blocked the path ahead. While doing this City of Silver chief's clothes tore apart by his rapidly expanding muscles. In the blink of an eye, Colin Iliad had turned into a giant that was nearly 6 meters tall. His body was grayish-blue and his muscles were bluish-black. He was a ripped giant. There was a dark crack on his forehead that seemed to be capable of attracting the souls around him, and his eyes were gone. Every inch of the giant's skin and flesh contained immense power, infinite mystery, and a strange spiritual influence. It made everyone who witnessed it inevitably feel a sharp pain in their psyche, turning them into a rampaging mess that wanted to destroy everything, including themselves. Inside the unshadowed domain, Colin Iliad didn't need to worry that the Divine Kingdom's suppression would prevent him from controlling this incomplete mythical creature form, causing him to completely lose control. The invisible barrier around him immediately shrank, turning into silver, sticky, liquid metal that covered his entire body and solidified into an armor that couldn't be shaken. At that moment, the shadow on Anuni's body condensed into something corporeal. It made him turn into a giant that was several meters tall. He held a black greatsword and wore black full-body armor. Black Knight. Clang. The black great sword cleaved straight down and was held back in midair by two swords formed from the light of dawn. The shadow beneath Anuni's feet and the illusory black wings on his back extended outwards in an attempt to envelop Colin Iliad. Almost at the same time, rays of the light of dawn formed around Colin as they swept forward. The storm that was filled with pure fragments of light swallowed Anuni's shadow, only to be blocked by his black wings. Clang! 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 Bang! 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 Colin Iliad's Silver Knight manifestation and Anuni's Black Knight transformation clashed violently, producing a spectacular light show as the tower collapsed. As for Derek, he leaped out with Thunder God's roar in hand after receiving the chief's signal, heading straight for the Sun Saint. Amidst the howling winds, he brandished the ghostly blue hammer that was wrapped in lightning. He appeared like a sailor of the storm pathway, not a beyonder of the sun domain. The Sun Saint never expected that the unshadowed opposite him would be so rash that he chose to engage in close combat. Unable to react in time, he could only use his instincts to dodge to the side. With a loud crack, a silvery white light burst out from the place he was about to step in. It quickly engulfed him and tore his body apart. The silver night evil spirit that Wuxia grazed also targeted the Sun Saint as it unleashed its attacks. A golden glow surged out of the Sun Saint's body like a tidal wave, melting the silvery white light, forming a layer of armor made of light and a huge mace. Boom! The mace blocked Thunder God's roar, causing the snaking bolts and light to fly everywhere. At the same time, the Sun Saint's body emitted a warm glow that caused the silver night evil spirit to suddenly turn illusory as if it was evaporating. It caused the black-armored Wuxia's body to pale. The degenerate aura quickly dissipated, causing the silver night marionette to weaken greatly. Purification. This was the core power of an unshadowed. It was extremely effective against wraiths, the fallen, and the unclean. Faced with the purification, Wuxia could only summon her silver night evil spirit back and not let it out to graze. She could only use the corresponding beyonder powers to make up for her weakness. Whoosh! 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 Silver beams of light occasionally blinked, flying at high speeds, forcing the Sun Saint to block and duck to protect himself. After taking a glance, Derek stopped brandishing Thunder God's roar again, nor did he pester the Sun Saint any further. He took a few steps back and cast his gaze towards the battle between the Black Greatsword and the Double Swords of Dawn. He then joined the battle between Colin Iliad and Inuni. His expression turned solemn as he spread his arms wide, as though he was hugging a gift from a deity. The unshadowed domain immediately became even brighter, as though sunlight had penetrated through the barrier and shone in. Right on the heels of that, a ball of pure light surrounded by countless holy flames descended out of thin air. It enveloped Colin Iliad and Inuni without any regard whether they were friend or foe. Flaring Sun. Flaring Sun of an Unshadowed. This was the theurgical spell that Klein had used to kill Megos and the fetus in her womb. It caused tremendous damage to creatures in the domain of corruption, degeneration, and undying. It could even directly destroy them. In the holy spherical light that was surrounded by holy flames, the illusory black wings on Inuni's back began to emit a faint mist. The pitch-black armor covering his body melted and part of his body cracked open, igniting his leaking degenerated aura. Colin Iliad was also injured. The silver armor on his body turned into liquid metal. Derek didn't pay much attention to this. He once again used Flaring Sun and once again enveloped Inuni and Colin Iliad. He believed that compared to the enemy who was of the degeneration and corruption domain, the chief who was of the warrior pathway would suffer a lot less damage under the assault of Flaring Sunday. He was able to last much longer. And after dealing with the main enemy, he could get Mr. World to summon Life's Cane to treat the chief. This was the fastest way to deal with Inuni. This wasn't something that Derek had come up with himself, nor was it part of the plan that Klein had come up with. It was something that Colin Iliad had suggested himself. Previously, when they were discussing outside the door, Klein had only introduced Inuni and the Shadow's possible abilities. He didn't come up with any proposals and had left it to the City of Silver's chief to decide on the battle plan. This was because he knew that Shadow understood him very well. He could think of anything he could think of. If it was based on his own train of thought, it would be easy to resolve. Therefore, trusting an experienced former demon hunter was the best solution under the present circumstances. Colin Iliad didn't stand on ceremony. He confirmed that the main target they needed to deal with was Inuni, who had been corrupted by the Dark Angel. He formulated a plan around this key point and came up with a plan to clinch victory through internecine means. He wasn't afraid of being hurt. He was only worried that there wouldn't be an opportunity such as this. The spherical light that was surrounded by infinite holy flames blasted down, illuminating the surrounding area. It made Klein's shadow dim significantly, making Inuni's black wings become fainter and fainter, almost to the point of an illusion. But at this moment, a pair of black wings suddenly separated from Enuni and transformed into a deep sea. Chapter 1256 I have something you don, the deep sea swallowed the bright spherical light, darkening the entire, unshadowed domain. Silver bolts of lightning burst out from its interior, turning the area where Enuni and Colin Iliad were fighting into a forest of lightning. Amidst the sizzling sounds, countless bolts of lightning slithered upwards and drilled into the gaps in the armor. This silver knight, who had shown his incomplete mythical creature form, immediately turned stiff, as though he was paralyzed by lightning. As for Enuni, his black armor, which seemed to be formed from powers of degeneration, had completely absorbed the lightning, preventing his body from being affected by the rippling damage. Taking advantage of this opportunity, Enuni, who had pitch-black fragments peeling off from him, held the dark greatsword with both hands and slashed at an angle. And at this moment, Colin Iliad hadn't completely escaped from his paralyzed state. With a piercing stabbing sound, a deep crack appeared on his left shoulder. The sturdy silver armor seemed to lose its defense as it was cleaved open by the great sword. This was a black knight's cull of spiritual flesh. Not only could it corrode flesh and blood, it could obliterate souls and cleave through barriers. It could also cause any living creature with degenerate thoughts to lose their defenses. It was a core beyonder power belonging to the Black Knight, stemming from the degeneration domain. Seeing that the cull of spiritual flesh had sliced open the silver armor on Colin Iliad's left shoulder, with the crack quickly deepening as it went straight for the heart, Derek tensed up and immediately condensed a spear made up of pure sunlight. He swung back his hand and threw it towards Enuni. Unshadowed spear. Enuni didn't abandon his attack or dodge. Instead, he raised his remnant illusory black wings and used them to shield himself. Sizzle. The unshadowed spear pierced through 2 layers of the illusory black wings, bursting out a blinding white light that seemed to give rise to a miniature sun. At the same time, Colin's entire body melted, turning into a pool of silver liquid metal. The liquid flowed rapidly, reforming the body of Colin Iliad in the distance. He still resembled a giant, and he was still wearing silver armor. However, half of the City of Silver's left shoulder and arm had fallen to the ground. The incision was clean with no blood flowing out. With the use of mercury liquefaction, Colin Iliad sacrificed an arm to avoid Enuni's lethal blow. His gaze behind his visor didn't waver at all. He grabbed the remaining Sword of Dawn and ran towards his target once again. It was like an unusually terrifying steam locomotive that exceeded its speed limit. Derek quickly condensed his unshadowed spear again from the side, causing the spears of light to fly towards Enuni. During this process, he opened his mouth and solemnly said, "God says that the purification is effective." This was the beyonder powers of a notary at the unshadowed level. Its compatibility with the unshadowed domain created by the Sun Saint made the battlefield brighten even more, causing the degenerate auras on Enuni and Lovia to further weaken. God said it's ineffective. The Sun Saint immediately denied Derek's proclamation, causing the unshadowed domain's purification effect to return to its former state. Amidst the crackling sounds, the unshadowed spear approached Enuni. As for the black illusory wings on the Black Knight back, a few pairs had already faded under the miniature sun's illumination. He only had half left. Enuni couldn't effectively dodge the pure, bright long spears closing in on him since his hands were full fending off Colin Iliad. He made a pair of illusory black wings spread out fully, disintegrating into darkness. As soon as the unshadowed spears came into contact with the darkness, they were stained with a layer of thick, sticky, blackness. They either instantly corroded and broke, piercing the magnificent staircase, or left a curved arc in the air as it spun around and tore at Derek Berg. All of them degenerated at that very moment. Upon seeing this, Derek followed his battle instinct that he had honed from all his years of training in his patrolling and exploring experience. He jumped forward and rolled. Sizzle. Black spears landed behind him, corroding a large segment of the staircase. At this moment, the Sun Saint was also throwing unshadowed spears, creating pure white beams that shot across the air. This forced Lovia to use one of her grazed souls to constantly blink in an attempt to approach the enemy. To her dismay, she could only use the ability of one soul at a time in such a state. She couldn't blink while condensing Silver Rapier to cull the Sun Saint from a distance to create an opportunity for herself. Meanwhile, the battle between Klein and his shadow was exceptionally intense. Amidst the booming sounds of air cannons, the flaring of scarlet flames, pieces of paper scattering in all directions, and illusions turned into bubbles described the battle. The Silver Knight marionette had basically suppressed the spectator saint. After all, no matter how strong the Mind Dragon's body was, it wasn't a match for a demigod of the giant pathway when in close combat. Of course, the spectator saint wasn't in any danger. After all, he had revealed an incomplete mythical creature form. If it wasn't for the fact that his opponent was only a marionette, and Klein had already digested the Sequence 3 potion and seen many high-level creatures, he could use his exposed godhood to interfere with his opponent's thoughts, slowly driving him crazy and losing his rationality. Without the advantage of the godhood's influence, the spectator saint could only use the hypnotist's battle hypnotism to force the target to act erratically, such as attacking in the wrong direction. Using this opportunity, he escaped from the melee battle and entered a psychological invisibility state again in an attempt to perform a sneak attack on Klein. A hypnotist's battle hypnotism could forcefully hypnotize the enemy during battle, making him do all sorts of erratic actions. However, such actions couldn't directly cause harm to the victim, and it couldn't be maintained for too long, as the target would quickly wake up. Of course, the battle hypnotism target of the spectator saint was definitely not the Silver Knight marionette. This was because it was essentially a dead person. This made it immune to all psychological effects. The target of his interference was the thoughts Klein transmitted through the spirit-body threads, targeting them so that the information the marionette received would be erroneous. As such, it would act differently from what Klein wanted. This was actually a psyche interference, and not a psyche hypnosis. The effects were undoubtedly not as effective as the original version, but not every saint of the spectator pathway could grasp such an effect. It was a result of digging deep into one's beyonder powers and experimenting. To the spectator saint, there was nothing he could do about this. This was because, be it mind deprivation, mind storm, or mind breath, none of them were effective on a marionette. The grayish-white dragon that had its head covered in shadows had tried to close the distance with Klein several times, or to use its area-off effect beyonder powers, but it was stopped by the Silver Knight marionette. It kept being forced to dodge the Silver Rapier, which could erupt within its body. As Klein controlled his marionette, he distanced himself from the spectator saint and dealt with his shadow. It wasn't too easy, but it wasn't too much of a burden. Suddenly, his spiritual perception was triggered as he entered a state of clarity unique to instances when his dream or mind secretly intruded. With his lucidity, Klein allowed a portion of his consciousness to rise to the sky and look down at his island of consciousness. Then, he saw Anuni, the one who looked aged with a face covered in shadows, walk out of the boundless sea of collective subconscious, opening the door to his body of heart and mind. This spectator saint didn't attempt to change the island of consciousness in Klein's mind. All he did was produce a dark spherical light which had tentacles growing out of it. He turned it into a seed that was hard to discover before letting it sink into the ground. A mental plague seed. Without any hesitation, Klein immediately switched locations with the Silver Knight marionette, preventing the mental plague seed from landing in his island of consciousness. The spectator saint noticed this change. Not only was he not disappointed, he even revealed a smile. This was because he had long used virtual persona to secretly plant the mental plague seeds on the still island of the Silver Knight marionette. Although this couldn't affect the marionette, it could unknowingly corrupt the enemy who swapped positions with the marionette and other targets in the surrounding areas. This was a kind of corruption and infection that targeted the island of consciousness and the psyche. It wasn't a direct attack, so it was difficult to use virtual persona to offset it. When the time came, the problem that Klein had temporarily concealed with virtual persona would completely erupt. He would quickly plunge into a passage for losing control, entering an irreversible situation. Shadow was no stranger to such situations, as Vin Rambus had used such a method before. As he secretly laughed at Klein for becoming crazy, reckless, arrogant, and acting like a clown, one who had forgotten lessons of the past, he snapped his fingers, summoning a scarlet flame. He then used it to jump over, embroiling himself with Klein. Another round of paper shreds flew in all directions as the intense battle destroyed the afterimages. After a short while, Klein suddenly stopped. He raised his left hand that was wrapped with transparent maggots and covered his left face. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. He let out a maniacal laugh, controlling the spirit-body threads around him like a madman, no longer distinguishing between friend and foe. On his right cheek, pale meat tendrils protruded out, as if they were worms of spirit that were about to bore out. When Shadow saw that Klein had gone crazy and was about to lose control, he was worried that he would be infected by the mental plague. He hurriedly made a scarlet flame rise up and swallow himself. In the distance, his figure emerged from the flames that had yet to extinguish. At this moment, the Silver Knight marionette would occasionally launch an attack and occasionally do a twitching dance. It was obvious that it wasn't under normal control. He no longer had the strength to stop the mind dragon manifested by the spectator saint. He allowed the other party to spread out his wings and fly into the air above Klein. He was prepared to use mind breath. The spectator saint didn't want to give his enemy who was infected by the mental plague a chance to breathe. He wanted him to immediately lose control. Suddenly, this mind dragon's actions became sluggish, as if every joint was injected with glue. In the next second, a silvery white beam erupted from his body, splitting his flesh and blood, tearing apart his spirit body. With his back bent, the laughing Klein slowly straightened his body calmly. He released the palm covering his left cheek, and he smiled at Shadow in the distance. Behind him, wave after wave of silvery white beams tore apart the mind dragon, turning it into pieces of pitch-black flesh. They fell to the ground, and the knight marionette in silver armor retracted his broadsword and looked coldly at Shadow. Looking at the slightly lost Shadow, the few worms of spirit on his left face curled up and stimulated the curved corners of a smile. You haven't seemed to have noticed that I have something that you don't. Chapter 1257. Too weak as he spoke, Klein raised his right hand. A piece of pitch-black and filthy flesh had appeared in his palm at some point in time. It contained an indescribable aspect of madness. The answer is, the hanged man's corruption, Klein said to Shadow with a smile. The thing that he had that Shadow didn't was the corruption left behind by the true creator. This was an influence that even the power of Sapphira Castle couldn't dissipate for the time being. And one thing he was certain of was that, before he met Dark Angel Sasra, the true creator wouldn't easily allow him to lose control or die. Therefore, he deliberately allowed corrupted parts of his body to be infected by mental plague, pretending that he had lost control. Then, he pretended to be controlling spirit-body threads in an aimless manner so as to cover up the fact that the target was actually the spectator saint. When the opponent launched a further attack, he successfully entered a sluggish state, creating an opportunity for the Silver Knight marionette. As he expected, the corrupted parts of him wrapped around the seeds of the mental plague, preventing the negative effects from erupting. During this process, Shadow had distanced herself from Klein because of his concern about the effects of mental plague. This made him fail to notice the abnormality of the spectator saint's spirit body threads. How could Klein not know how careful and cautious he was? Of course, Klein couldn't predict the kind of changes the corruption would bring when he met Dark Angel Sasra. Would the mental plague that had been suppressed leak out and cause certain effects? All he could do was resolve the problems at hand. Upon hearing his words, the pure Shadow suddenly burst into a scarlet flame that instantly engulfed him. At the edge of the unshadowed domain, near the place where the giant king resided, a wisp of fire rapidly rose up as Shadow appeared. he didn't hesitate to escape. He ran towards the palace, which acted as the resting chamber for the slumbering dark angel, completely ignoring Enuni in the Sun Saint. When Klein, who was using his virtual persona, saw this scene, he was stunned. He couldn't help but smile with the worm of spirit and shake his head. "I'm actually that timid." He suspected that Shadow, which splintered off from him, had taken away most of his caution and carefulness, leaving behind more of his impulsiveness and recklessness. "Pa!" A silvery white beam lit up and smote the scarlet flames that descended outside of the unshadowed domain, shattering the pitch-black shadow that had just appeared. Klein hadn't wasted time muttering to himself. He had long controlled the Silver Knight marionette, then according to the distribution of the flames and his habits, he predicted the next few areas that Shadow would jump to. Then, he condensed Silver Rapier ahead of time and smote down the moment the flames descended. Unshadowed domain didn't have a barrier in the physical sense. Anyone could leave or exert influence on the outside world. However, the torn-up shadow eventually turned into thin pieces of paper and quickly disappeared. Another few burning scarlet flames descended, and the black shadow used them to jump, moving closer to the open door of the giant king's residence. The silvery white light that subsequently tore him apart had only managed to take down his paper figurine substitutes. From Sequence 5, Beyonders of the Warrior Pathway had the ability to see through illusions. Without the aid of psychology invisibility, paper figurine substitutes were obviously more useful than illusion creation. It was only a situation when two seers were in combat that scenes of shredded pieces and illusions would occur. In just 2 or 3 seconds, scarlet flaming columns rose outside the giant king's residence, as though they were releasing fireworks to welcome a guest. In the next moment, Shadow jumped into one of the flames and hid in the area where the dark angel lay in slumber. But at that moment, a figure quickly appeared in front of the scarlet flaming columns. He wore a black long trench coat and a half-top hat. His right face was normal, and his left face was formed from transparent and twisted maggots. It was none other than Klein's true body. The corners of his mouth curled up once again as he snapped his fingers with his right hand. "Pa!" The scarlet flaming columns were extinguished as the black shadow was forced to appear, returning to the staircase that was covered with the light of dawn. Flame controlling. The reason why Klein could rush outside the giant king's palace to intercept Shadow ahead of time was because, after Shadow decisively fled, he was no longer able to effect his summoning of items from the historical void. He easily took out creeping hunger and switched to the traveler's soul. "It isn't a good thing to be too careful," Klein said to Shadow, doing so with a smile on his face. As he bent his knees, he arched his back. As he bent over, his figure suddenly became the knight in silver armor. The knight stabbed his broadsword into the ground and created an invisible barrier, sealing off the door to the dark angel's resting ground. At that moment, Klein swapped positions with his silver knight marionette. He gave Shadow the impression that he could enter the palace as long as he could destroy the Guardian's barrier. Of course, his true body interfered with Shadow's summoning of historical projections and controlling of spirit body threads. When the tables turned, the battle between the 3 demigods of the City of Silver, Enuni, and the Sun Saint also changed. When Colin Iliad once again kept Enuni, who had lost his black armor, busy, Derek repeated their previous strategy. At times, he would use Flaring Sun as an area of effect attack to trade injuries to the chief for a victory. At other times, he would condense a pure, white, unshadowed spear and engage in precision attacks. This wasn't used often, because it was easy for Enuni to avoid it, causing Colin Iliad to be accidentally injured. After 3 rounds of Flaring Sun, Enuni finally reached the end of his rope. He once again spread out the last 2 pairs of illusory black wings, turning it into a pitch-black sea that devoured all light. He then drowned out Colin Iliad, causing the City of Silver's chief's body to be covered with a layer of thick black liquid. His actions were clearly affected. Seizing this opportunity, Enuni escaped from the entanglement and avoided the subsequent, unshadowed spear. He transformed into a shadow and quickly moved towards the giant king's residence in an attempt to join forces with Shadow to break through the barrier. At that moment, a silvery white beam burst out from his body, ripping him into blobs of dark red flesh. This sudden surgical strike came from Wuxia. This 6-member council elder had actually given up on dodging the attacks of the Sun Saint. At the instant Anuni was about to escape the battlefield, she decisively switched the grazed soul to the Silver Knight evil spirit, dyeing her black armor silver. Sizzle! The dazzling white and pure, unshadowed spear hit the lady, causing her to shrink slightly in the blazing sun to completely devour her. The blobs of flesh in Anuni's body remained sentient. They quickly gathered together in an attempt to rebuild the body. However, at this moment, the black sticky liquid restricting the movement of Colin Iliad exploded with specks of light. They turned into a storm and tore through the obstruction, allowing the silver armor to resurface. Right on the heels of that, the gigantified Silver Knight took a step forward and swung the Sword of Dawn in his hand, allowing the hurricane of light from before to continue sweeping forward, inundating the blobs of dark red flesh. A pair of illusory black wings appeared and dissipated, calming the hurricane of light. However, Derek's flaring sun continued. Holy flames ignited every blob of flesh and drop of blood, melting everything with pure light. When the Sun Saint saw this scene, he knew that it was impossible for him to escape the fate of being destroyed. He didn't bother dealing another blow to Wuxia and turned around, about to withdraw from his unshadowed domain. Suddenly, he heard a voice filled with malice and corruption, slow. Wuxia struggled to free herself from the remnant powers of unshadowed spear and teleported to a spot not far from the Sun Saint. Then, she switched the grazed soul to a devil and used the language of foulness. At that moment, the black armor on her body had completely shattered. There were many cracks on her purple-patterned black robe, revealing her slowly squirming flesh. Her aura was rather weak. The slow that wasn't at the level of a demigod couldn't affect the Sun Saint for too long. However, this was enough for Colin Iliad. He condensed a silver rapier and made it teleport to the enemy. This silver rapier experienced a random mutation. It directly pierced through the holy armor of the Sun Saint and exploded in his body. Silver light bloomed as the Sun Saint blasted into countless pieces. Pa! 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 The flesh fell to the ground and vanished in a blink of an eye, as though they had returned to the pages of history. After the battle ended, the 3 demigods of the City of Silver immediately approached the giant king's residence and pincered Shadow. Shadow leaped and attempted to hide in the fog of history. However, just as he saw the grayish-white fog, he was pressed down by a hand wrapped by transparent maggots. Neither him nor Klein dashed to the time before the first epoch, because they knew that the other party would definitely stop them or wait there. With nowhere to hide, Shadow immediately fell into the encirclement of the 3 City of Silver demigods. His various powers were also offset by Klein. Even Flaming Jump was affected by flame controlling, making it difficult for him to escape his predicament. More than 10 seconds passed. After the paper figurines were torn apart, Shadow finally expended all his substitutes. He was then stabbed in the abdomen by Derek's unshadowed spear. A round of blinding white light and a miniature sun exploded. The pitch-black shadow quickly faded and completely melted. Klein felt a stabbing pain in his head, and his mind, which was on the verge of losing control, suddenly relaxed. He instinctively looked to his feet and saw that under the illumination of the light of dawn, a faint black shadow extended out from them. Too weak, Klein bent his back slightly and couldn't help but mock himself. After all, without the powers of a scholar of yore, without a marionette, and without the ability to control spirit body threads, a seer was relatively weak against other demigods of the same sequence. His spirit had been restored to its original state, but he had yet to remove the virtual persona. Furthermore, he had no intention of immediately summoning Miss Justice's historical projection to do this. As he had been corrupted by the Dark Angel, Enuni had shown the characteristics of the Sun, Spectator, Storm, and Secret Suppliant pathways. If he wanted to enter the Giant King's residence, he had to be wary of psychological influences. Virtual persona was a very good defensive measure. At that moment, the transparent maggots on the left side of Klein's body quickly settled down, returning to his flesh and skin. However, due to the crazy effects of his virtual persona, there was still a translucent layer on the surface, allowing people to see the worms of spirit hidden underneath. When Derek, Lovia, and the others cast their gazes on him, Klein straightened his back and reached out to grab Life's cane. He pointed at the open door of the Giant King's residence and laughed. "Make every second count. The Dark Angel is waiting for us inside." Chapter 1258 Tremendous changes. Although Klein was urging them on the surface, he actually threw Life's cane to the bottom of the magnificent staircase and threw it at Lovia, allowing her to treat herself and Colin Iliad's injuries. As a former Rose Bishop, Lovia was the least afraid of the negative effects of Life's cane. Regardless of the changes in her body, as long as it didn't involve the spirit, she could treat them. At the same time, Derek quickly ran towards the collapsed battlefield in the middle of the stairs, picking up the severed arm of the chief. As long as a broken limb wasn't lost, Life's cane could heal the injuries, restoring it anew. With an exaggerated smile, Klein nodded at Colin Iliad and leaped into the fog of history. He dashed to a time before the first epoch and hid in a fragment of light. Then, with a thought, he returned to Sapphira Castle and sat at the seat belonging to the Fool. With the help of the crimson star corresponding to the Fool, which was constantly contracting and expanding, he checked the situation inside the Giant King's residence. However, under his true vision, there was a deep darkness inside, indistinct and indiscernible. As expected of the left hand of God. The Deputy of Heaven, a king of angels that is suspected to be related to the Chaos Sea. Klein sighed silently as he frowned slightly. He now suspected that, even if Little Sun entered the palace and prayed inside, it would be difficult for him to see the exact situation through the darkness. Unless he became an angel and truly gained ownership over Sapphira Castle. In addition, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that there were still many unknown effects hidden in the slumbering grounds of the Dark Angel. He definitely couldn't be careless. He immediately reined in his thoughts and observed the situation around him. He searched for high-level existences like Adam and Amon, but he didn't find anything unusual. After letting out a breath, Klein hurriedly shattered the miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic that he had separated from the curtain. He made the parts consisting of sequence 9 to sequence 3 gather together, making the sequence 2 portion pure. Then, he returned to the historical fragment and was once again affected by virtual persona, becoming more like a clown. In the next second, he left the grayish-white fog and reappeared in front of the door that opened into the residence of the Giant King. The Silver Knight marionette that had inserted the sword into the ground and created an invisible barrier immediately stood up. At this moment, the severed arm of Colin Iliad had already been reattached. Lovia had also recovered from her injuries. However, at some point in time, a few golden wheat heads grew from the back of her head and swayed. They walked to the door together with Derek and returned Life's cane to Klein. After receiving it, he shook it and stopped maintaining the projection, making it vanish into thin air. Right on the heels of that, he made a grab with his right hand, intending to summon the historical void projection of Miss Messenger when she was in perfect condition. At this moment, Colin Iliad suddenly asked, "You plan on summoning that angel?" "It's not necessarily that one. I have too many choices." Klein spoke the truth in a slightly exaggerated tone. Colin had already dispelled his giant state and regained his original height of more than 2 meters. After all, maintaining an incomplete mythical creature form was still a huge burden to him. At that moment, he was wearing a silver armor he conjured. He held 2 swords that had returned to their normal sizes and said calmly, "That corrupted monster showed the characteristics of degenerating living creatures. The place where the Dark Angel sleeps should have similar effects." What the chief means is that the angel projection that Mr. World summons might rebel after entering the residence of the giant king. And a fallen angel, even a projection, is easily able to make us pay a heavy price. Derek easily understood what the chief meant. On the other side, the flesh on Lovia's head was squirming as she enveloped the few wheat heads and fused them with herself. Makes sense. Klein smiled and nodded, gently snapping his fingers. Then, he dragged out an ordinary raven from the fog of history, allowing it to fly past the open door and enter the dark interior. When the raven's figure was swallowed by the dark environment, Klein's eyebrows moved slightly. He turned his head and smiled at the City of Silver chief. "I've lost contact." Colin Elliot replied without any surprise, "That's a king of angels for you." Klein couldn't control the corners of his mouth from curling up. To him, this was a rather troublesome matter. It meant that he couldn't summon a historical projection to enter in his stead. The fact that his shadow had been sliced off also proved this point. "All right." As if stretching his wrists, he waved his hands a few times and took out a black staff with many gems embedded in it. 0 to 62, Staff of the Stars. He could only try to see if the sealed artifact projection and a marionette would degenerate and betray him. After all of them were prepared, Colin Elliot, Lovia, and Derek simultaneously cast their gazes towards the darkness behind the open door. Using the Staff of the Stars in his hand, Klein pointed ahead and said with an obvious smile, "This is going to be a dangerous journey. Everyone has a chance of dying. For you, and for me." With that said, he pressed down on his top hat and followed behind the Silver Knight marionette. Passing through the open door, he entered deep darkness. Colin Iliad, Lovia, and Derek didn't speak. They walked forward in silence and determination. Backlund, in the battlefield outside the city. Using light to adjust her dragon transformation appearance, Audrey and the demigod in Phasation military uniform, who wore a mask and gloves, engaged in a fierce battle. The other party's impregnable defense, the broadsword that had been condensed from the light of dawn, the rapier's ability to hide and teleport, left a deep impression on her. If not for the fact that she knew that the upper echelons of Phasak and Intis were mostly silver knights, demon hunters, iron-blooded knights, war bishops, unshadowed, justice mentors, alchemists, and arcane scholars, and had gathered intelligence in advance at the Tarot Club and did some homework, Audrey, who lacked individual combat experience, would have long been defeated. Relying on her accumulated experience in this aspect, she managed to withstand the initial attacks and finally composed herself. Relying on battle hypnotism, mind deprivation, mind breath, and mind storm, she slowly turned the situation around and escaped her predicament. Of course, the most important thing was that the godhood brought about by dragon transformation had interfered with the Silver Knight's mind and thoughts. Furthermore, it allowed Audrey to possess a body that could withstand damage, as well as providing a power that could withstand attacks. Otherwise, she would have sustained injuries from barely being able to hold on. And as a Sequence 3 Saint of the Warrior pathway, this Phasation general had a strong will and uniqueness that was unaffected by illusions. He was able to effectively resist the effects of the mind and reduce the negative effects he received. Therefore, he still held the upper hand and used light concealment and silver rapier to suppress Audrey in an attempt to create an opportunity to defeat the enemy. Audrey was very calm about this. This was because, while fighting, she had already created a virtual persona. She had diverted her attention to the surrounding environment and had scattered many mental plague seeds. It wouldn't be long before the Phasak general was silently infected. At this moment, red flaming spears shot over from the Allied forces' base, blotting out the sky with their denseness. The Silver Knight didn't dodge, instead, he took a step forward and swung his Sword of Dawn, keeping Audrey fixed to the ground. Whoosh! 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 The burning spears pummeled down one after another, blanketing the two demigods. Audrey's face could not help but distort. Charred marks covered her grayish-white scales of her dragon transformation body. As for the Silver Knight's armor, it was still glowing with silver light. It didn't suffer much of an impact. Compared to a giant who specialized in defense, a dragon's ability to withstand blows was obviously much weaker. Only at this point did Audrey realize that she was participating in a war, not in a solo battle. When another wave of flaming spears was about to hit them, there seemed to be a commotion within the Allied forces' base, and there was a collapse to a certain degree. At that moment, the thick fog that enveloped the entire battlefield vanished, as though it had never existed. Audrey and the Faceac general stopped fighting at the same time, finding themselves abnormally weak. They even found it difficult to raise their arms. She saw that, behind the Allied forces' base, at the edge of the boundless plains, an orange-red ray of light rushed over, instantly covering half of the sky, blocking out the sun. The area around Backlund instantly turned into dusk. The thick darkness appeared on another side of the sky and very quickly collided with the orange sunset. All the soldiers and officers on the battlefield fell to the ground and fell into a deep sleep. In Backlund City, outside St. Ireland Cathedral, Leonard, who was wearing a red glove, looked up at the half-dark, half-dusk sky. His throat let out a silent sigh as he cast his gaze at the entrance of the St. Ireland Cathedral. The brown-haired Cancer Bernard and the other members of the machinery hive mind stood there, staring blankly at the sky. Just a few months ago, they enjoyed a deep level of cooperation with Leonard's Red Gloves team. Together, they dealt with the evil forces in Backlund, searching for the secret organization that believed in the Fool, the one that used tarot cards as a codename. At the bell tower of the Cathedral of Waves, the City of Generosity, Byam, Danitz watched the resistance enter the city and take over many places. Finally, he heaved a sigh of relief and turned to Alger. "Look, they're very popular in most places in this city." Alger's gaze followed the slightly dark-skinned natives as he didn't respond to Danitz. Danitz felt very relaxed as he chuckled and said, "I never expected that we would meet again in such a situation." Alger looked up and was just about to say something when he suddenly felt something. He cast his gaze towards the northwestern sky. The place he was looking at instantly darkened. Layers of dark clouds formed and countless silver bolts of lightning snaked out. Many deep blue waves surged up and were swept up by the wind. They rushed towards the clouds and connected to the sea. Wherever the sea and the sky intersected, beams of light lit up. They weren't resplendent or clear, without any colors. They seemed to be formed from countless illusory objects. Chapter 1259 Slumbering Grounds in a battlefield near the capital, Lemberg. The balls of compressed scarlet fireballs flew past the corpses, weapons, blood, and smoke, under the guidance of a flaming spear. They landed in the areas that were built with simple construction work, creating a series of explosions. As he watched the smoke rise and the flames spread, Anderson flung the dust in his hands and turned to the deputy beside him with a smile. "I wonder how much longer this will last. Any last words? I can help you write a will." As he had wished, he saw the angry looks of the militia around him. Their thoughts were uniform. However, the militia didn't attack. The glint in their eyes slowly settled as they cast their gaze in another direction. "You actually didn't respond to my provocation." Anderson pricked up his brows. "This means that you're planning something." Without waiting for the deputy and the militia to respond, the hunter smiled and continued, "Y'all are planning on surrendering, right? Are you trying to protect your family and friends?" Seeing gazes sweep over, Anderson sked and shook his head. "You haven't become Beyonders for long. It's only through the war that you obtained the main potion ingredients from the enemy. Only then did you become hunters, provokers, and pyromaniacs. However, when it comes to plotting conspiracies, y'all are still too inexperienced. I'm very curious. Why don't you try to convince me to surrender together? I don't think I project the image of being very firm usually. Besides, I'm not a believer of the God of knowledge and wisdom." Having said that, Anderson looked thoughtfully at his deputy. Is it because the enemy's brass is totally furious at me? They gave the order not to accept my surrender. The deputy remained silent for a few seconds before saying, "Since you already know, why are you asking?" With a swoosh, the nearby militia raised their right hands and aimed their palms at Anderson, appearing to have come to a collective understanding. "If I don't ask, how can I be sure what everyone's thinking?" Anderson said with a smile without panicking. He rubbed his stomach with his left hand and placed his right hand into his pocket. It was unknown what he was looking for. At that moment, the sun in the sky suddenly expanded and became extremely huge. The blazing golden sun made Anderson and company unable to open their eyes. They found it difficult to think any further. Immediately following that, an illusory tower appeared. Every level was made up of thick books. Each book had a brass eye on it. The higher one looked, the darker it became. It was filled with the aura of insanity, destruction, inauspiciousness, and disaster. The tower extended into the sky, as though it had encompassed the entire world within itself, including the gigantic sun. Backland, within the Odora family's luxurious villa. All the sanguine in the city had gathered here to prepare for the impending outcome of the war. Emlyn White, who had become an earl, had his hands in his pockets. He stood by the window, bathed in the mixed light of dusk and night as he watched members of his fellow race discuss the current affairs uneasily. Suddenly, his spiritual perception was triggered as he cast his gaze out the window. In the garden, a bunch of withered grass was dyed green once again. They rapidly grew and soon, they reached the height of a person. In other places in the city, some of the street-side trees that had not been affected by the previous bombardment were wildly absorbing nutrients from unknown sources. One by one, they rose up and soon grew to tens of meters tall. The branches were thick and the leaves were like umbrellas. These towering trees were connected to one another, covering half of the sky in Backland. Many buildings were crushed, or they were entangled by the branches and vines. It was as if they had been abandoned for more than a century. In just 7 or 8 seconds, many places in Backland had become a primeval forest. After passing through the open door and entering the dark interior of the giant king's residence, Klein immediately observed the silver knight marionette in front of him, the staff of the stars in his right hand and creeping hunger on his left hand. They didn't show any abnormalities for the time being. The corresponding spirit-body threads didn't show any signs of degeneration. After confirming the situation in this area, Klein cast his gaze around and observed his surroundings. The place was enveloped by thick corporeal darkness. They couldn't see further than 5 meters away. The ground was paved with grayish-white bricks that looked like they were pieces of a frozen sunset. They didn't reveal anything extraordinary. After some thought, the corners of Klein's mouth curled up. He reached into the void, grabbed, and attempted to summon an angel. In the next second, he laughed out loud because he had lost a clear connection with the fog of history. This was the reason why the historical void projection he had summoned to enter had lost contact after entering this region. Laughing, Klein suddenly turned around and walked back to the area from which he had entered. "Mr. War, Sparrow, what do you want to do?" Derek, who was also scrutinizing the various restrictions on him, asked in surprise. Klein replied with a beaming smile, "Now is not the right time to explore this place. I plan to come in again later." "Are you planning on summoning a sequence 4 historical projection and try to see if it will degenerate and betray you after you bring it in?" Colin Iliad said after some thought. Klein spread his left palm and said, "No one set the rule that we can't go out once we enter, or not being able to enter after leaving." Although in such a situation, Mr. World's words sounded a little strange, Derek still felt that it made sense. This was because the City of Silver had done the same thing when exploring the surrounding areas. Through repeated acts of entering and exiting, they gradually accumulated intelligence and details to finally resolve whatever problems they faced. Lovia didn't say a word or object. From her point of view, it was undoubtedly a good thing that she could make more preparations. In an exploration that determined the fate of the City of Silver, they definitely couldn't be rash. After taking a few steps back, Klein suddenly stopped and laughed out loud. It looks like the owner doesn't want us to leave. The faint light at the door had already been devoured by the deep darkness and disappeared. Colin Elliot surveyed his surroundings and said, "We can only proceed forward." Seeing the chief and Mr. World turn around at the same time, Derek took a deep breath and raised his left hand, letting it emit a golden glow that illuminated the surrounding darkness. This revealed thick columns with indiscernible tops. Some of them had their silhouettes outlined, while others were hidden deep in the depths, barely visible. Derek retracted his gaze, preparing to head forward with Mr. World and Chief. At that moment, he failed to see another familiar figure from the corner of his eye. Derek's pupils dilated suddenly. Then, he quickly turned his head to look for Elder Lovia, who had been standing beside him moments ago. This demigod who believed in the true Creator had disappeared. She had disappeared without a trace. Derek's abnormality was noticed by both Klein and Colin Elliot. At the same time, they cast their gazes at the spot and saw that the black-robed Lovia had disappeared without a trace, as though she had evaporated into thin air. With the spiritual intuition of a seer and the reconnoiter abilities of a demon hunter, they failed to realize when Lovia had gone missing, or how she vanished. The curl on the corners of Klein's lips grew even wider. Without any hesitation, his mind raced and allowed his spirit body to enter the world above the gray fog, combining with the dark red illusion of the Fool. Right on the heels of that, he cast his gaze towards the crimson star that symbolized the sun. He hoped to find clues through his true vision. However, everything was still obscured by the darkness. Nothing was revealed, just like how Klein predicted before entering the Giant King's palace. Without any time to think further, Klein immediately returned to the real world. In the span of 3 or 2 seconds, there was only Derek and the Silver Knight marionette by his side. The city of Silver Chief, who was wearing silver armor, had disappeared. What just happened? Klein asked with a warm smile. Derek looked at him in shock, confusion, and panic. Didn't you see it? The moment he finished speaking, the shadow under Derek suddenly came alive. It rapidly extended upwards and enveloped him and the sunlight he emitted. After the shadow completely covered Derek, it fused with the surrounding darkness, no longer separable. Klein had originally raised his black staff to prevent an anomaly from happening, but in the end, he didn't do anything. All he did was watch with a smile. After a few seconds, he noticed that his body had turned black and dull, as though he was being melted by the environment. Similarly, Klein didn't try to save himself. The corners of his mouth curled up as he watched with a slightly shaking head. After his figure completely disappeared, his vision changed. The darkness was gone. The grayish-white stone bricks, the surrounding walls, and the huge pillars appeared clearly. They were covered in a layer of faint shadows. Outside the window, there was no sun, no moon, and no stars. However, a faint light shone through the window, making the entire palace appear sinister, dark, and cold. In the deepest part of the palace stood a very faint shadow, resembling curtains. Lovia, Colin Elliot, and Derek stood at a distance not far away from him. They carefully observed their surroundings as though they had come to another world. Unfortunately, my marionette can't enter. Klein waved the staff of the stars in his hand and smiled at Derek and company. His indifferent attitude and the chief's calm and composed manner made Derek quickly calm down. He no longer allowed his fear and panic to grip him. Colin Elliot nodded slightly. Just as he was about to share his speculations, he suddenly felt something and turned to look at the deepest part of the palace. Klein, Derek, and Lovia did similar actions. In the deepest depths of the palace, that faint shadow dissipated, revealing a flight of steps meant for giants and an iron-black throne at the top of it. Sitting on a throne was a man with black, slightly curly hair that reached his shoulders. His eyes were covered in shadows, and his actual appearance was extremely blurry, preventing others from seeing him clearly. Layers and layers of black wings fell down from behind him, covering most of his body. The robe was black with silver threads embroidering it. They formed complicated patterns and had gorgeous accessories hanging on it. At that moment, the man had his left elbow on the armrest, holding up one side of his face with his palm as though he was in a deep sleep. Chapter 1260 Omniscience. Without needing anyone to make the introductions, the four demigods present clearly understood a reality. The giant-like man who was sleeping on the iron-black throne was the left hand of God, the deputy of heaven, Dark Angel Sasra. Amongst them, Wuxia could clearly sense the oppression coming from this absolute high-level existence. It was like the response when praying to the true Creator. It was an aura that could cause her thoughts to scramble, her soul to degenerate, and her body to tremble. Suddenly, she heard a burst of laughter. She turned her head to the side in a daze. Klein bent his back slightly and laughed. He is still sleeping. Should we directly wake him, or wait for him to wake up? If we choose to wake him, how should we greet him? Hey, Your Highness Dark Angel. Rose Redemption Leader. These two questions sounded ridiculous and arrogant, but they had managed to shake off the influence of the environment and made Colin Iliad fall into deep thought. Just now, they had instinctively considered the first question. It was rather important, and it concerned their subsequent actions. Colin Iliad thought for a moment before saying, let's not wake him up for the time being. Try approaching him and search for clues and information. That's my thoughts as well. With his left hand, Klein casually snapped his fingers and walked towards the black throne. At this moment, he felt fortunate that he had already taken care of Shadow and restored his spirit to its complete state. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to completely restrict his virtual persona. When he was imagining how to do the greeting, he almost blurted out, "Hi, Sassy." Seeing that Gehrman Sparrow had taken 2 steps forward, Wuxia finally snapped out of her daze. I'll give it a try using a grazed soul. This was a relatively safer method which wouldn't harm the expedition team. Klein nodded. With his black staff in hand, he turned to his side with a beaming smile. A 3 to 4 meter tall phantom image appeared in front of Wuxia. A pair of goat horns lined with mysterious patterns sat atop its head. Its skin was black and matte, exuding a sinister fullness. It was a devil. It was different from the devils that he had seen before. Its body was covered with signs of decay, with yellow-green pus hanging off it, as though it was mixed with the power of degeneration. As Klein casually sized up the phantom image, the devil spread its huge bat-like wings, causing the light blue flames on it to burn even more vigorously, dissipating the strong smell of sulfur. It took a step forward, slowly approaching the iron-black throne and the staircase meant for giants. Using its intuition for danger, it surveyed the area for any abnormalities. While Colin, Klein, and the other demigods were paying attention to it, they also began scrutinizing the details of the shadowy palace. They discovered that behind the iron-black throne that Sasra was sleeping on, there was a pair of dim, grayish-blue double doors that depicted sunset. This might be the door that leads to the outside world. This thought flashed across the minds of the 3 City of Silver demigods, Colin Iliad, Derek, and Wuxia. At this moment, the devil, who had traveled midway, suddenly paused. It was enveloped by a cluster of silver lightning and quickly faded away after being blasted to pieces amid crackling sounds. A pillar of light with swirling holy flames smote out of thin air, completely purifying the soul that belonged to the devil. Wuxia didn't feel any pain from losing her grazed target. She only frowned slightly and couldn't think of a better way to probe the way. Klein looked around and said with an exaggerated smile, as expected, I'm the man for the job. As he spoke, he slowly walked forward. As he took out a box of matches from his pocket, he lit them one by one and casually threw them around. I've always been a little timid. After throwing half a box of matches, Klein turned around and explained with a smile. And even Derek Berg wasn't convinced by this sentence. Following that, under the illumination of the scarlet flames, Klein continued walking towards the iron-black throne that might have belonged to an ancient god. When he arrived at the spot where the devil's soul was destroyed, his left palm suddenly tightened. Klein lowered his head and saw that creeping hunger had returned to its human-skinned form. An exaggerated crack opened in his palm. Inside were 2 rows of illusory white teeth. This sealed artifact was attempting to gnaw at Klein's flesh in a bid to consume both his body and spirit. Creeping hunger had degenerated. Tisk. Klein let out an obvious sigh as he glanced at the staff of the stars in his right hand. He confirmed that the Grade 0 sealed artifact which didn't have any living characteristics had yet to show any abnormalities. He then raised his right hand and stuffed the other end of the staff of the stars into Creeping Hunger. Creeping Hunger bit at it a few times before it finally calmed down when sensing the suppression effect of a higher-level entity. After laughing twice, Klein took another few steps forward, covering a few meters. Cracks suddenly appeared in the shadows that covered the walls, pillars, and tiles, as one brass eye after another grew out. A figure appeared in front of the countless eyes. He was first presented as the black-haired, light brown-eyed, and cold-looking Gehrman Sparrow. Following that, he warped into the black-haired, brown-eyed, scholarly-looking Klein Moretti with ordinary looks. Then, he degenerated into a blurry image, and a grayish-white fog emanated from him. At this moment, these figures that seemed to expose all of Klein's secrets came to a halt. Boom! He exploded, transforming into countless illusory fragments that fell to the ground and disappeared. Klein raised his brows and sked with a laugh. The omniscient power of the reader pathway. Just as he finished speaking, the brass-colored eyes, which grew out from the surrounding shadows and the ground, trembled. They emitted an ethereal voice that seemed to come from ancient times, the aura of Sapphira Castle, Sapphira Castle. Colin Iliad seemed to recall something and came to a certain realization. It's only possible to get a response or approach Sasra with a Sapphira. That's why, despite the hanged man clearly having Lovia, a demigod believer from the City of Silver, he still forced me into the palace to meet the Dark Angel. It wasn't easy for Klein to control his virtual personality's instinct to speak. Before he could consider what to say, the brass eyes hidden in the shadows emitted another voice. Your fate has intersected Ammonises, Leodoro, Adam, Ammon, Heribergen, Aucases, Medici, Ouroboros, as well as him, with regards to the true names that the brass eyes had mentioned. Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia were no strangers to the names. They knew that the first was the Evernight goddess, followed by 7 of the 8 kings of angels. Furthermore, there was no lack of sequence 0 true deities in the present day. This left them somewhat stunned. They couldn't believe that Gehrman Sparrow would have crossed fates with so many high-level existences who exceeded sequence 1. Together with the sleeping Dark Angel before him, Mr. World and the 8 kings of angels had already crossed paths. How impressive! Derek marveled from the bottom of his heart. Klein was in no mood to quip about his divine interpersonal skills. With an obvious smile, he asked, him. Klein believed that him referred to the true creator. After all, he still had his corruptive influences left in his body. The brass eyes on the shadowy curtain fell silent for a few seconds before saying with an ethereal voice, he is another me. The true creator was really another side of the ancient sun god. The side that was born from the god's corpse. It's a side filled with hatred and viciousness, one that controls degeneration. Klein gradually drew an equal sign between the black and gloomy infant sitting in the cavity of the ancient sun god's chest and the true creator. He had also gained initial confirmation that he was talking to the psyche left by the Dark Angel Sasra. He thought about it and couldn't help but smile. Why did you form Rose Redemption to assassinate the ancient sun god? The information that the question revealed was something that Colin Iliad and Lovia already had an inkling and some speculations of. However, after hearing Gehrman Sparrow say it with their own ears, they still felt pangs of depression and confusion. The curtain that covered the walls, stone pillars, and floor tiles trembled, but the sleeping Dark Angel remained motionless. Those brass eyes stared at him and said, "Sun God is just my original honorific name. You should now address me as, the Lord who created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God, or God Almighty. I can tell that you've been leaning in that direction all this time." Finally, Klein laughed out loud. Then, he felt a lingering fear. This was because he was mocking heaven's deputy, the left hand of God, a king among kings of angels, as well as his true form. To not anger the other party, he quickly repeated the question, "So, why did you betray yourself and form Rose Redemption with the Evernight goddess to assassinate yourself?" The brass eyes fell into silence once again. The curtain-like shadows that blanketed various areas swayed gently without stopping. After a few seconds, the ethereal voice slowly said, "The primordial one had awoken in my body." Upon hearing this answer, Klein's pupils dilated. For some reason, he felt his hair stand on end as his back turned cold. It was very close to his guess, but it was even more terrifying. At this moment, the shadows around him thickened. It became more and more sinister and gloomy, as if it was giving birth to some terrifying, unknown, redoubtable danger. Although Colin Iliad, Derek, and Lovia didn't understand the meaning of Dark Angel Sasser's words too well, they were still affected by the sinister and harrowing words. It left them shuddering in fear as they trembled. The primordial one had awoken in my body. These words echoed in the air for a long time.